Right Honourable Member for Norfolk, everything of which he said, I think I completely agree with. I want to start by thanking the Honourable Member for Newport West for securing this debate, and also for thanking all those people who signed the petition that raised the profile of this important issue. Let me start, Mr. Evans, with a few quotations. Drugs policy has been failing for decades. We need fresh thinking and a new approach. Now, those aren't my words, but the words of the Prime Minister David Cameron back in 2005, when he was a contender for the leadership of the Conservative Party. At that time, he also said it would be disappointing if radical options on the law on cannabis were not looked at. Now, since then, he has very sadly reversed his position almost 180 degrees and done what sadly all too many politicians do when they've secured power: ignore the evidence and, in the face of what can be a hostile media environment, retreat to the status quo. My own position, as I've set out repeatedly in this House, is that we should be guided by the evidence, that we need an urgent review of the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act to determine whether it's been effective and to consider whether alternative approaches might better reduce drug-related harms. The fact that other countries and some US states have been more committed to following the evidence than the UK has been to date in relation to cannabis creates, I think, an opportunity for us to learn from their experience, whether that be decriminalisation or some other form of regulation. And in particular, I think there are clear and compelling grounds to legalise cannabis for medical use. And having studied the evidence, I'm fully persuaded that we need to do just that. Not because it's popular, although it is, with 53% of the UK public backing the legalisation or decriminalisation of cannabis for medical and non-medical use, according to an Ipsos Mori poll from last year. Not because many of those who already use cannabis-based medicines testify to the positive effects, although they do, with many claiming benefits in relation to chronic pain, including that caused by neuropathy, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, and others such as MS sufferers citing its benefits. And not because the UK lags behind other nations when it comes to recognising the therapeutic values of cannabis, although it does, with, amongst others, 20 US states, Canada, the Netherlands, the Czech Republic and Israel, legalising the production and supply of cannabis for medicinal use. No, the reason that I am fully persuaded is because there is a strong evidence base that justifies looking in much more detail at exactly how we should regulate the production and supply of cannabis for medicinal purposes. And I think we owe it to people like my constituent, Charlotte, a 34-year-old mother living with a palliative cancer diagnosis. Now, she told me, when you're faced with such a diagnosis, you either accept it and let the rot set in, or you look outside the box. She says that she's found cannabis oil and believes that it is saving her life, allowing her to live well. She says, I would be dead or very, very ill were it not for cannabis oil. And she goes on to say the government is shooting itself in the foot. If it supported cannabis and proper evidence-based trials, and if they were properly funded, it would have a huge impact on the cancer costs. I believe we owe it to Charlotte and the many people like her who use or want to use cannabis medicinally to stop our ideological opposition and start gathering and then listening to the evidence. Because trials of the regulation of medical-based cannabis could, for example, answer questions about how you differentiate between different types of use, how to avoid the potential for leakage into non-medical supply, facilitating research that might otherwise be hindered, and if successful, perhaps providing a potential stepping stone for regulated legal production and supply of cannabis more widely. Because in those countries where medical cannabis is already regulated, it's important to note that implementation and practice has varied enormously. Some models have been very successful in demonstrating what effective, controlled production and responsible prescribing or retailing can look like. Elsewhere, regulation has been inadequate, leading to over-commercialisation and irresponsible sales practices and promotions. All this and more must be looked at within an agreed framework of what might be achieved through regulation, so any proposals brought forward in the UK learn from and build on existing good practice. And that applies, I think, not just to medical cannabis. We have an opportunity to learn from countries like the Netherlands, Denmark and some US states who've also introduced various regulated models for the sale of cannabis for recreational use as well. Colorado, which became the first jurisdiction in the world to legalise cannabis in 2012, demonstrates the benefits of ending the criminalisation of users and putting government in control of the trade. Despite dire predictions, early evidence suggests that legalisation in Colorado has had the following positive outcomes: no spike in cannabis use among young people, thousands no longer receiving criminal records, no increase in road fatalities, and a significant reduction in the size of the criminal market, as the state now controls 60% of supply. Now, in these times of austerity, it's also interesting to note that in Colorado, for example, legal marijuana tax revenues have been breaking records. Through the first 7 months of this year, Colorado has brought in nearly $73.5 million, putting the state on track to collect over $125 million for the year, with $40 million of that allocated for school building programs. Now, if that kind of benefit can be properly balanced with a regulatory regime that minimises individual and social harm, as indeed theoretically governments are supposed to do with the production and sale and use of alcohol, then why would it not make sense to be open to alternatives to prohibition? There's growing pressure to learn from what's being tried in other countries, here in this House, with the House of Commons Home Affairs Select Committee concluding that government action is needed now more than ever to learn from the models adopted in, for example, Portugal. We should also be paying attention to the evidence from closer to home. For example, when in 2004 cannabis was declassified from a Class B to a Class C drug in the UK, most estimates suggest a decline in cannabis consumption or no change. A study from Newcastle University Business School also concluded there is generally no evidence for an increase in the consumption of any other drugs by young people, in particular heroin, cocaine, crack, amphetamines, ecstasy, acid or glue, as well as the consumption of any Class A drug. There is no evidence for an increase in various forms of criminal behaviour, including drug production and distribution, with a possible exception of a small increase in property crime among 15 to 17-year-olds relative to just the 15-year-olds. And finally, there's no evidence for an increase in antisocial behaviour, for victimisation or any other types of risky or antisocial behaviour. In other words, and this is borne out by looking at long-term trends across drugs and other different classification regimes, illegality or otherwise has very little effect on whether people use drugs. With pleasure.